Welcome to the, now that we're on the fourth Tuesday, I have to think about it a while, the October meeting for the Internet Developer Group. This is going to be a very interesting meeting. I think if you think about the things that are going on the Internet right now, messaging has become a very hot topic. A lot of people are interested in all the different ways, and if you look at the things that Park's doing, other people, you have a lot of people concerned about SMS and instant messaging, and it just seems that that's really the running thing. Before we get into it, I was going to just tell people we've now hit over 41,000 people look at our archive, so we continue to be a point of contact on the net for people that want to know about technology. Hooray! Our speaker tonight is well qualified to discuss the topic of messaging, and not from the hype standpoint. Terry Olkin is the CTO and co-founder of Sigaba, and if you want to know what Sigaba is, if you're into the encryption game, Sigaba was a machine used by the United States in the Second World War that was never cracked. And so when you think about messaging, that's a good thing, right? You don't want to get cracked. Sigaba is in the business of building enterprise messaging systems. It could be email, it could be instant messaging, it could be EFT, I guess, financial statements and things like that. But how do you do that securely? And that's his main focus. In today's world of viruses and blasters and everything else, I think it's becoming everyone's main focus to try and do things securely. Before that, he was with Open Horizons. He was the VP of Engineering at Open Horizons, and it was interested in doing real-time messaging. I'm trying to understand how much more real-time messaging can be than instant messaging, but maybe there's a way to. Maybe he was stopping the boat from hitting the dock as it was coming into the slip. He held managerial and technical positions over a 6-year period at Oracle, and was one of the founders of their advanced technology division. And before that, he worked for Microsoft and developed persistent XML and enterprise messaging, persistent storage, a lot of the things that Microsoft is finally talking about. Terry talked to them about many years ago, and maybe the echo's coming off the wall, and they're finally hearing them. So this should be a very interesting presentation, and we'll see if instant messaging can be done safely. Terry Olkin. Thanks.
Thanks for having me here. I'll also say the reason we came up with Sigaba is because at the time Sigaba.com was one of the few domain names actually available. Go back to 2000 and try to figure out how hard it was to find a domain name. Spend weeks. That's the first thing you do in a startup. As far as Microsoft, I always thought that they had bugged my office. Every time I came up with an idea, then next thing I knew, Paul Allen had a product around it. So I stopped doing that. But anyway, we started Sigaba about 4 years ago, almost, and basically we're doing secure messaging generally. In this talk, I'm going to not talk about Sigaba. I'm going to talk about the focusing on instant messaging. And when I originally talked to Bill, we had this this idea of talking about instant messaging in terms of where it's going with the net, is it the future, and so on, but also in terms of why is it where it is, and what's going to prevent it from getting there, and kind of this idea of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So try to make this talk a little entertaining as we go through it. Well, what I'm going to do is I basically have a set of topics, and for each one I'm going to go through the good, the bad, and the ugly, and not necessarily in that order. So some will start at one end and some will start at the other end. But basically, these are the things I'm going to cover. This isn't a big group, so if you have any questions, in the middle, you can just feel free to interrupt, and we can answer the questions as we go along. And at the end too, we can field some questions there as well. But we're going to talk about standards in terms of IM, which is maybe one of the more controversial topics. I thought we'd start with that one. But it also is kind of important for some of these other ones. Interoperability is going to be a direct consequence of standards, as it turns out. We're going to look at productivity, and that's one of the big question marks with IM. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Security is, that's kind of where we focus on. So that's probably where I have the most to say, perhaps, about instant messaging and messaging in general. But I think that's going to be the barrier, as it were, to getting this thing going in the enterprise and making it real and doing business on it. A little bit about cost and bandwidth. Again, there's some myths there, what's real, what's not. And then some things to look for if you're looking to deploy these things or not deploy them, or I'm in a weird building to be talking about some of this stuff. One of my ugly slides was going to be, well, I'm glad I didn't do it. There's some things to look for as vendors if you're looking to buy these things, as vendors try to pitch them to you. And I'm going to maybe put some things out there that says, hey, if they're telling you this, maybe you should think about it. Kind of the used car salesman trick there. And then come back to the future. But before we get started, I just want to, there's some words that even I've learned about this. I'm actually relatively new to instant messaging, only been looking at it for a few years. And so there's some terms that people are using, and they have very specific meanings. And so I just want to make sure that, at least as I talk about them, you understand when I'm saying a certain word, what I mean, because I'll always use those words. A lot of people talk about IM as this general application of messaging back and forth, but it actually is composed of at least two, usually three separate type of things. Presence is really that part that gets you started. That's where you know whether somebody's online, what their status is, are they active, and so on. That's exemplified through buddy lists nowadays with a little icon, green, red, yellow, whatever. A lot of people say presence actually is the real killer app as far as what messaging is about. Is somebody on your cell phone? Are they at their desk? So on. It's knowing where somebody is, because you can then know who to contact. You don't have to waste time finding the right person if I know that person is at their desk or at their phone or so on. Especially as presence extends to the cell phones, which is starting to happen now. You're going to know more about where people are instead of less. And I think, I'll come back to presence later on. So presence is one part of it. In fact, you can have presence all by itself. You don't actually need the messaging part of this. And some people say that's 90% of the application's usefulness is the presence part of it. IM, in this instance, or in this case, or this way I talk about it, is an actual one-on-one conversation. So we're going, and some people use it as a verb. I'm going to IM you. That's now becoming, I don't know what the French are going to do about that, but that is starting to be a big issue, is IM meaning one-on-one versus chat, where that's been defined to me, and I didn't make up these definitions, by the way, but I'm just going along with them. Chat is typically refers to more than two people involved in conversation, hence chat rooms, or converting an IM into a chat when you invite somebody else. So, but those are the three typical things you're going to find in most IM systems nowadays at a minimum. Then you get into some other things. Transcript. When I use transcript, that's a complete recording of the conversation. That'll come up later on in regulations and security. But transcript is a pretty important requirement if you're talking about IM in the enterprise. Security, generally, that's a big word. And being in the security business, I'm kind of particular about how that word gets used, because it gets thrown around a lot by people. And oftentimes they're using the word security, but they really mean often encryption. And encryption by itself is just not enough. Take anything away from this, encryption does not equal security. So when we talk about a secure system or a system that really should have security, we're talking about everything: authentication, privacy, integrity, authorization, non-repudiation, auditing, so on. All of those things together make up a secure system, not even any one of them or two of them. And finally, public IM. That's often referring to the public IM systems, AOL, MSN, and Yahoo, as opposed to the non-public IM systems. But just so that we're clear on what a public IM system, I mean, there's probably other smaller players out there, but quite frankly, we all know of these guys, and there's between them have like 2 times the population of the United States or something on there. So that's the public IM systems. And we're going to contrast that to the enterprise class ones later. Okay, so now let's get started. I'm going to first start with standards. And I don't remember which was which, so there'll all be surprises to me as far as where we start from. Okay, we're going to start with the good on standards, because there is some good. The good is that people are actually starting to talk about standards. They're starting to appear. The IETF has actually got some standards going. The two most popular ones out there are this SIP simple standard and XMPP. The SIP slash simple standards, hard to say, are really being backed by IBM and Microsoft primarily through their products, Microsoft's RTC, real-time communication server, and IBM same time. XMPP is really being backed by this product called Jabber out of Jabber open source, and that is an XML-based standard. So that's the good news.
Do you have any preference between those two?
Yeah, I'll get to that. The bad news, that'll be the most controversial part of the talk, I'm sure. The bad news is, like all standards, there's more than one. And again, IBM Microsoft is backing one, Jabber and a bunch of others are backing the other. Now, Jabber sounds like this little tiny thing compared to Microsoft and IBM, but the fact of the matter is there are millions of people who are using Jabber-based IM systems now. So you got this thing where you just have the masses are using one, and then you have Microsoft and IBM are trying to push the other ones. And you know, the reality is I don't like either one, but I mean, myself, and I'll tell you that's really, to me, the ugly part. These aren't the right standards, either one of them. I'll tell you why. In my opinion, of course. SIP. Okay, SIP is, I mean, in the internet world, relatively old. I think it was a 1998 approved standard. It was really meant to do something else. It was meant to set up multimedia sessions between two or more clients. It's about a 150-page spec. And if you've read RFCs, you know that a 150-page RFC is pretty much unreadable. But it was there. I mean, it was a standard. And when you look at Microsoft, and I was there at a time when Microsoft was really just starting to take standards a little more seriously. I mean, they're the ones who really were pushing XML at the time. And I was actually working with one of the guys who was really leading that group in Microsoft. And it was actually a blow to Microsoft when he left and tried to form his own company, but then he took half of Microsoft with him, and then they sued him. And that got ugly. But
that's the ugly.
Yeah, but it was like I think their mentality is let's latch on to a standard that's kind of good enough, and let's go with that because it saves us time having to develop a standard. Plus, we look like good guys because we're getting into the standards. And this, by the way, I was also there right when the big antitrust trial was going on. So this was a big deal to be more standards and open and all that stuff. But SIP itself just doesn't do IM. It's not right. So Simple came along, which is SIP for instant messaging presence leveraging extensions. I mean, that probably took 3 months right there. But basically, this came along because they realized that SIP couldn't do the job. And in fact, Simple is really taking one of the, 8 or 9 commands available in SIP and saying, okay, let's really build this other thing around it, but it's still kind of like that. So it's like, if you're familiar with HTTP and there's, get, post, head, and all these kind of different methods, well, they picked one, because SIP is actually similar to HTTP in that sense, which is actually the good part of SIP, actually. And they basically said, okay, we're going to take this one little piece here. So of the 150 pages, we'll take like maybe 6 or 10 or whatever it is, and we're going to, that's our standard, by the way. And now we're going to make this simple thing, which is actually technically not a standard yet, but they're still working on it and so on. And so they're working on that. But I still personally think it's still not quite right because if you don't have the ability to start from scratch and you're trying to do something and you're dragging all this baggage along, I mean, we know what happens when you have standards designed by vendors who don't want to really start over and so on. So that's where we are with SIP and Simple. And then you have XMPP. Now, this is, I understand, the XML was the big thing, right? Everybody had to have their own markup language. That was it. There's XML for seeing eye dogs. There's XML for hearing. There's XML for for instant messaging. But if you've actually read the standard for this thing, it's just not going to scale. There's a lot of overhead. I mean, there's a lot of parsing involved. I mean, why do we have to have standards that are human readable for computers to process? Which that was actually a big issue for the guy I worked for at Microsoft. He wasn't a big fan of XML either for that reason, is because he was giving up all the efficiencies of binary for text. And so, that's great for Intel, but are we really taking a step forward or backward? But in particular with XMPP and Jabber, they basically formed the whole conversation as a long-running, open-ended XML document, right? Which is a little weird to begin with. But you actually send things over. You have to parse entire bits of XML just to know what's going on. There's a lot of extra encoding and so on. I mean, it's big because it's XML, right? That's really the reason. But I don't like it. In fact, I like the SIP a little bit better because at least it goes back to the good old, stalwarts of IETF and RFC as far as MIME and SMTP and HTTP and so on. And it's a lot simpler. Certainly from a processing point of view, it's easier. We all know it. It's header, colon, variables, it's bodies. It's the same HTTP codes. We're all familiar with it. We don't have to learn anything new. And the better thing is you can separate control from data. And that's very hard to do with the way they define XMPP. Now, one of the big problems with all these standards is they really haven't even addressed security. They've made a passing, waving hand at it, and that's going to be the big problem. Is as usual, security is being pushed off onto the side. But having done security for the last decade, I can tell you that it's very hard to add security onto something once it's already there. You have to build it in from the bottom. And if I pitch my company a little bit, I mean, it's really that's maybe the thing that we do differently. Is we started with security and go from there. Because if you start from the beginning, then you can make it so the users don't even know it's there, and you can get better security than otherwise. So, but we'll come back to that security part a little bit later. So that's the standards part. Now, interoperability kind of is going to come out of standards, as is kind of obvious. But the good news is, there's some products out there that give you the illusion of interoperability. For example, this product called Trillion, which is a client, and it can it looks like you're connected to all the different IM systems through a single client. So it gives you the illusion that things are working together. But it really isn't. We're still quite a distance away from the interoperability that we expect, which I think we've set the standard with email. We know that if you have an email address, I can send you email, end of story, right? I mean, that's it. You need an email address, I can send you email. We're very far away from that with IM. We wouldn't even know where to begin. And it's going to be dependent on standards. Even if we emerge and we have two of these standards, I mean, if your system's talking XMPP and mine's talking SIP, we're still not going to be able to talk to each other. So at some point, to really get the interoperability that we expect to have in email, something's going to have to give. And right now, these two groups are pretty far apart. I mean, SIP is a very different looking beast than XMPP. So, I just don't know what's going to happen there. Now, here's the ugly part. IM is a weird thing because it was born really in the commercial world. I mean, it was really born I actually was going to dig up the name. Maybe somebody knows what AOL used to be called in 1985 before it was called AOL.
Not American Online.
No, it was like GNN. I never even heard of it. I don't remember what it was. I just read a magazine. I put the magazine down. Next thing I know, there's 1,000 magazines. I don't remember which one I picked it up in. So, but I mean, so AOL claims to have invented, or at least the person who wrote this article claims that AOL at least invented it commercially back in '85. But of course, if you were going to college before that, I'm sure we were all using IM-like things, as we all know, way back before 1985. I didn't just lose this hair yesterday. So
talk.
Yes, talk. Exactly, among others, right? Phone on the VAX, VMS, right? Which, of course, now everyone claims that they have patents over this stuff that we've been doing for 25, 30 years. But that's a whole other talk I can give. So what's the real incentive for their interoperability? I mean, AOL for a long time, did not want to open up their community of users. I mean, why should they? They got 100 million of them, and they were all locked in. And it took the government to kind of force them to do something, and they recently even backed off on that. We know Microsoft tried to break in, and that didn't work, which is kind of funny for Microsoft to be trying to break into somebody else's thing. But You know, it's like they're really, it's a business issue, unfortunately. Whereas a lot of our other, things that we've developed over the internet have been developed in academia and, open source and so on. And there's just been the natural incentive of the developers to make it work. This one is being held up, as it were, by these very large companies. And the weird thing is it's the presence, mostly. Because presence is this online active server that has to be running for it to be useful. And where is that going to run? Who's going to own that? Then there's a lot of information that's going in and out of those servers. So who's going to pay for all that bandwidth? Right now, public IM is free, and people want public IM to remain free, but somebody's got to pay for it. It's not really free, and I think that's our biggest issue to getting to true interoperability. Because even if we agree on standards, say SIP or whatever wins out, AOL, Yahoo, and Microsoft still have to go and implement it, and they still have to open up their servers to allow other IM systems to interoperate with it. So there's still a long way to go, and I think that's going to be a big issue. But again, that's my opinion. Let's move to productivity. We'll start this time with the ugly. Limited to teenagers. This is what was happening back in 1985, I guess. I was a teenager in 1985. But that's what they're. In fact, up until extremely recently, IM was really was not really being used in the workplace, and when it was really to talk to the friends, family, and teenagers. So there was an issue about is this getting in the way? Is this a productivity tool, or is this really causing problems? I talked to a bunch of CIOs in the financial vertical market, whatever, in May of, I guess it was 2001. Yes, maybe 2002. I can't remember. And at the time, they were worried about how do we stop this thing. How do we turn this thing off? People are downloading it. We don't know what's going on. We don't know if they're using it for good or bad. We have no idea what's going on. But more importantly, the common perception was that IM equals, spreading gossip. It was talking to family. It was like, when are we going to have dinner? Hey, or actually, it was even worse. It was, let's talk about the boss, because they don't, we can all sit in our cubes and laugh, and instead of standing around the water cooler, so it's not so obvious that we're talking about the boss. It even was used potentially for bad, like sexual harassment was happening, and companies were becoming liable for these things, because public IM, you could just blast, I guess, windows up on people's workstations without them asking, or without you asking them, or them saying yes, and you could say whatever you want, and it was already too late. So these were issues. And that was the perception. It was, these things are bad. But studies have shown, and people have been doing studies, that in the workplace at least, it's actually being used to get real work done. It really is becoming a productivity tool. And people are now saying, I can't get along without this thing. We now have people going through college. I just heard this a couple weeks ago. I was at a financial summit, and we were sitting around a table, and as usual, we opened it up, and nobody had anything to say. But luckily, there was this a young woman. She had probably just gotten out of college, and she said, I'm working on the trading floor or something like that. Maybe not trading floor, but in a little group. And she went through college on IM. I mean, they did everything in college at IM. And when she went there, her boss said, you cannot use IM. No IM. No IM for you. Yeah, that's it. No IM.
Withdrawal.
So, and she didn't know what to do. I mean, she's like, if I gave my kid a video cassette, I had no idea what to do with that thing. And it was the same thing. They didn't know what to do without IM. And she was trying to convince the boss that this was not a bad thing, this was a good thing, and so on. So there's the misconception is starting to get better that IM in the workplace is actually a good thing. I for one, really never used it before 2 years ago, or maybe less. And now I use it all the time. A lot of the people I work with are all over the country. And that's by far, the easiest thing to do. Especially when you're at home on a weekend and you find that one of your peers is working and he's in New York and he's stuck and he can just send you a message and he doesn't, you don't bother. It's different than you call somebody on the phone. You don't want to bother them at home by ringing the phone. But setting up an IM and say, are you available? Could you help me? That's a whole different thing. And that's what's starting to happen in the workplace. And I'm sure people use it. I'm sure you probably are not sitting there just chatting. You're actually getting work done. But the study also showed that a lot of these conversations are really using IM as a point, as a starting point to get the conversation onto another medium. Because a lot of times just doing it in text just isn't sufficient for a lot of these people. So they're saying, when can I arrange to have a phone call? When can we have a video conference? Or even when can we get together in person? So a fairly high percentage of this study that I'm, one particular study anyway, that I'm talking about was the conversations were setting up other conversations. So I think the good news is IM in the workplace is actually becoming a good thing, and in fact it's becoming a necessity. But let's talk about security. Well, I mean, IM systems really punted completely on security, but why would they care? I mean, their audience was teenagers, right? There was no security issues there. They didn't care, about spam as it relates to IM, right?
Well,
which is I can just put up messages.
With teenagers there are security issues if you talk about some of the less pleasant participants in our society. Don't they have to worry about that?
Well, does who have to worry about that?
AOL is not responsible for matching up 15-year-old girls with 50-year-old guys?
No.
Really?
Well, but even if they were, I mean, how would they prevent that? I mean, they would have to know very strongly who each person was that was logged onto their system. I mean, a lot of these public IM systems are anonymous. I mean, you can get any email address on any of these systems, right? I mean, you don't ever have to prove who you are.
Right.
If you can type, and apparently if you have a reasonable vision, to type, look at the blurry picture and say what it is, you can get an email address nowadays. But when I talk about security here, it's the security of the conversation. It's knowing who you're talking to. It's knowing that nobody else can see that. It's knowing that what I type is what you see, and it's knowing that somebody who cares is recording this because they might have to show it in court later on or to a regulatory agency. So the public IM systems don't have it, and frankly, they don't really need to. They don't really see the point. But what sometimes is worse is when you think you have security and it's not really there. And this kind of comes back to what I was saying before, where some people equate security with encryption. And this is where one of these yellow flags come up. If a vendor comes to you and says, or if you ask, well, what's your security, tell me about your security, and they go, oh, well, we use SSL. And that's usually the end of it. They don't even know where to go after that. I mean, they're just, what? You mean and? Didn't I answer your question? And a lot of people, a lot of vendors, actually believe that SSL is security. I mean, SSL at best will encrypt data between 2 points, but that's it. So if you ever hear that, you almost want to go run screaming from the room. If you're really in the market for enterprise class systems where security is an issue, SSL by itself doesn't do it. And actually, I think I come back to this later, but even if they have SSL and they have all the other stuff, SSL is also a little bit of a warning because there's certain scalability issues about it because of the way SSL just inherently works. And so you still want to be careful. Even if they have all the other stuff, SSL still, it tells me anyway that maybe it was kind of a little bit of an afterthought. This is one of those things, we just threw it in at the end kind of thing. And again, because security is often bolted on to after the fact, you get these really non-scalable approaches to the problem. Again, SSL is a good example. If I have more like a hub and spoke kind of architecture, and I'm using SSL, and I have to go first to the hub and then to here, well, that's 2 decrypts right there. And imagine now I'm having a chat with 10 people. Well, now that's 11, right? And so on. So, and that's just a real simple, example of that. But also, when that message pops out on the other end, or if it needs to go to a transcript or a server, or whatever, I mean, there's nothing. SSL didn't do anything for the data itself; it just did it for that pipe, and that's usually the least of your problems. So, and the security interoperability is, unfortunately, there's standards in security in terms of algorithms. We all, everyone pretty much agrees on certain algorithms that do certain things, and we're all happy with that, and the government certifies them and all that. But when you put them all together into an application, a package, then you start having problems where the things don't talk to each other. This is one of the problems in the standards, if you go back to that, where the best that they've addressed is they've said, well, we're just going to use PGP as our security for SIP. Well, I mean, not only that, that's not going to scale, and they don't even specify it enough to figure out how in the world you might actually implement it so it would work with somebody else's stuff. So it's kind of an exercise left to the reader. As long as somewhere in there you use the letters PGP, then you can say you're with the standard. But I think we got a long way to go with interoperability and security in general. I mean, look at email. I mean, how many people encrypt their every message? Right. I mean, I'm the only one. Unfortunately, that doesn't help me a lot. That's the problem, right? We've had email forever, and we've even had some standards. SMI is a standard for securing email. It's been around for a long time. Nobody uses it. Why don't they use it? Well, they don't use it because it's hard to use, but they also don't use it because it doesn't interoperate. There's a lot of reasons around it. But that's going to be the problem. So because people put in these last-minute bad security solutions, they end up being pretty easy to defeat and work around and so on. So it's a big issue, and if you're looking at enterprise stuff, this has to be a concern because now we have all these laws, these regulations that basically say if you don't do this right, you could go to jail. I mean, certainly in healthcare and HIPAA, they actually talk about that. Or you can get penalized and fined. And in fact, I probably shouldn't say their name, but they're one of the largest banks, if not the largest, that they basically told me, he goes, we know, we are unable to comply to the regulations. We just pay the fine every day until we can figure it out. They know, they write it every day. They just like, the fine's getting paid every day. They know they're out of compliance. They just proactively send a check to I think the SEC or whoever it is. And they're still trying to figure out how to work around it without completely tearing out their architecture. And when you're that big, it's certainly not that easy, but it just goes to show you really have to think about it ahead of time. But the good news is, again, it is starting to appear. People are giving it more than just lip service. I have seen the AOL Enterprise Manager, kind of gateway product. They certainly talk a lot about security, but if you dive down to the details, which I made the mistake of doing, you quickly see that there's a lot of answers, at least the people I talk to don't know the answers to. So there's still a ways to go, but it's not a completely lost topic yet. But unfortunately, there's not much else good on the security front as it relates to instant messaging. Okay. Cost and bandwidth. This is another one of those perception things. Slams the network and grinds it to a halt. This is another big concern that all the CIOs have, the IT directors. Man, if I put this IM in here, I'm going to have to tear out my network. I'm going to have to go to 12 gigabits and add all these servers and all this other stuff, and nothing else is going to work. And I don't want to do that. I'm going to have to buy more capacity, new equipment. I'm going to have to upgrade. Oh, by the way, they're just going to use this to talk about me behind my back. They're not going to get work done, and we're just going to have a lot more of non-work getting done. So that's not good either. But the good news is these are mostly all myths nowadays. They're really, most IM systems nowadays are implemented with fairly reasonably, so they don't really slam the networks. I mean, we have this running, and we didn't have to do anything more to our network, and it was already there. But I mean, of course, it always depends. I mean, your mileage may vary, kind of thing. I mean, if you are running a big organization with 10,000 people and they're all online at the same time, and there's a lot of activity going on, I mean, sure, there is going to be network. I mean, it's got to go through something. And so, yes, you might have to upgrade, but not to the extent that I think people, especially the CIOs and the IT managers, were afraid of that it was going to take. Just even putting this thing in there is going to cause that. Now, I have heard stories, though, where people are downloading the free, public IM clients, and then, of course, they get their whole group to do it. And then, because the network wasn't really set up for the amount of that work, then they are getting slammed. The networks are getting halted because the network was really meant for very low usage and not for maybe more normal usage that we're probably all more used to. So, yeah, those people did have bad experiences because it was never going to work in those environments. And the worst part, of course, is that they're really upset about is that they went and downloaded all this stuff without asking. And that is what they're really upset about. And it's very hard, by the way, once you have those things running around in your company, to turn it off. That's the other thing that they determined is that this stuff is very hard because people get attached to it very quickly, and then they get all their friends in the group to do it, and then they're, that's it. That's it. So So really, the CIOs and so on are not trying to, now they're no longer saying we need to get rid of this stuff. They're now trying to figure out, okay, well, let's bring one in that we can control, that we can manage, that's going to work, that's going to scale, and all these things. So I think they've gotten a hint because a lot of people said, look, we're going to use this no matter what. So you have those battles. Now I'm going to talk about architectures that we would deploy in an enterprise situation. So again, these are my opinions. There are some that are just straight peer-to-peer architectures, although I don't know how many are really being sold, by vendors. But some talk about them. Maybe they're open source. But the problem with this, of course, is the IT department really didn't gain anything through this. There's no centralized control. There's no real, maybe the security is probably not even SSL because it's between two clients that would require getting certs on both of the clients. Central transcripting, and even if they're at best would be on each client machine. We know clients are really untrusted, so that doesn't really mean much anyway. So from an enterprise point of view, a peer-to-peer type of IAM deployment is not really practical. I can't set policies in one place. I can't enforce things like virus scanning or any of those kind of things. Peer-to-peer is nice for many applications, but I don't believe it's really good for this one. And certainly when you come to presence, where it's, everybody who cares about me, I need to tell about, how do I do that? If multicast were implemented perfectly across the internet, that would be a great solution. But unfortunately, again, one of these other standards that didn't quite make it. A slightly better version would be some combination of peer-to-peer and centralized. This is actually a little bit more popular. I think Napster actually did something like this, where you'd go to, I'm not a music person, where you'd go to basically a central server, and then you would negotiate a peer-to-peer connection between the two clients to transfer. Sometimes in IAM systems, it's just for file transfer. If you want to transfer files between, you would negotiate the peer-to-peer connection because that way the file can go directly to that person. It's very, it's better for the network, and then everything else would go through the hub, certainly the presence and maybe other things. But the problem again is it could bypass security. Certainly, if you are using it for moving files, those files aren't being checked. You don't know what's going through them. Unless everybody has virus scanning deployed at their desktop and you have it in the mode where it looks at every file as it gets saved, you're going to miss viruses and things like that. So, unless you're really moving maybe big files or a lot of them and network usage is really tight or something, then maybe this becomes a viable option. Otherwise, you have to really look at it. But I think that the best one is just centralizing everything, because from an enterprise point of view and from a control and security point of view, this is going to give you everything, no question about it. In fact, it gives you very nice properties about things like privacy, because two people never actually send messages directly to each other. It always goes through, a central hub. In this case, centralized is more of a logical thing. It doesn't mean there's one computer process running that does everything. It just means that all your clients talk through this kind of central cloud, as it were, and then messages go out from there. It gives you, one point of administrative control. All the security is there. For file transfers, you can implement virus scanning at one point, so that might even be cheaper than having to deploy to the desktops. You'll update pattern files in one place. You can determine which two people can talk to each other and which ones can't. You can set up bridges that go outside your enterprise through your firewall and things like that. So it just gives you a lot more control. But what are you giving up? Well, maybe you're giving up scalability, but again, it really depends on how you're using the system and so on. If the system is architected, well, I don't necessarily think it gives up the scalability of a peer-to-peer network, and I think that what you get instead outweighs this maybe one negative, which would be the classic thing between a peer-to-peer and a hub-and-spoke kind of system. But when you look at all the benefits you get out of it, being able to monitor what's going on and so on, and these are all things that are important to an enterprise. Now, as an individual, I might not like it, but when you're working in the enterprise owns that stuff, right? So what are the various different deployment scenarios? Well,
excuse me a second.
Sure.
One of the issues in Europe right now is whether or not privacy constraints on IM are like privacy constraints on telephone or email, and in which case hubs would then have to make sure that food and enterprise they weren't compromised. And that turns out to be a big limitation for deploying in Europe all the time, given European IT.
Right. Yeah, it's difficult to know, and that is an issue. I mean, who owns that stuff? But I mean, even the regulatory bodies now are saying where they didn't have rules around instant messaging before, and so it was kind of this, okay, do what you want because it wasn't explicitly listed as email or phone, which had very specific rules about what to do, especially in the financial and healthcare industries. Now they've now added IM because they realize that, and actually it's on the behalf of the behest of the companies. They're saying we want to use IM, but we also don't want to be in non-compliance with regulations. Tell us what to do, and they're basically, a lot of them are saying, well, treat it like email. You need to save it. You need to save it for 7 years or 5 years or whatever. You need to be able to search it. You need to be able to answer a query within 24 hours of us giving you one. It has to have, you have to basically treat it like you would those other things. So at least over here, they basically have said, look, just treat it the same. It's just another channel of communications. And there's also rules about what you can and can't say over IM, just like there's the same rules about what you can't say over email and so on. And in fact, I think that's one of the things about messaging in general is, and I know there are people that disagree with me, hard to believe, but that basically say, the how you communicate, whether it's by voice, fax, IM, or email, is really independent of what it is you're saying. Because the rules are really about what it is you're saying. Whether it's I can't say dirty words, or I can't give tax advice, or I can't send out my trade secrets or whatever. That doesn't matter if what's the difference between whether I email that to you, or I print it out on the printer and mail it to you, or fax it to you? I mean, the same rules apply, right? I mean, if the rule says don't give out my phone list on email, I'm pretty sure they also don't want me to give it out, by posting it on a billboard. So, as we start to unify the policies around that stuff, I think that the messaging becomes secondary. In fact, then you can kind of get to neat things where you can start with email and end up with IM, or vice versa, start with text and so on. I mean, there's people that talk about text to email, text to IM, and IM. I mean, I shouldn't care if I have an IM conversation with you, whether you're actually on a phone or another IM, or maybe you're not even online at the moment. I may not care. Maybe I may not even talk to a person. I'm talking to a bot somewhere. I hear those are patented.
Right now, regulatory issues are different in the U.S. than in Europe.
Oh, very different.
Yeah, and they're actually in conflict over things like IM.
Yeah. Well, firstly, they take privacy way more seriously than we do, apparently. And but if you have a good system from a security point of view, at least they should be a little bit happier. I've not dealt directly with them just to tell at least me say what's wrong with an approach that we've taken. But I'm looking forward to that day. So talk about the deployment scenarios here. The obvious, the common one, the first one, were these public IM systems. These are essentially purely hosted. You download a client. Everything you do goes out through your firewall to a web farm controlled by maybe even this very building, for all I know. Or maybe not.
Not this building, down the hall.
Maybe in Virginia. I don't know where it is. So, but it's hosted. I mean, this is a pretty typical hosted thing. If you're a small business where you don't really need security, it's just about messaging or small groups or whatever, and they do exist, then this is a perfectly adequate solution. It doesn't cost you anything, I don't think, and you can go for it. But that's if you're talking about enterprise, that's a fairly small number of people, because at the end of the day, if you're doing business and you want to conduct transactions, or you want to know who you're talking to at the other end, these public systems just aren't going to work. There are companies that sell what are called gateway solutions. A gateway basically is essentially a box that sits on your side of the firewall. You still are using the public IM systems. So you're using the clients. You've downloaded those, you're running those, but they're all pointing at this box. And this box is performing some kind of security on it. Initially, what they did is they did logging. That was the big thing. Hey, if we just know what you're saying, we'll be happy. We may not know who's saying it or who you're saying it to, or other people can see it or whatever, but we've written it all down. So that was the initial thing. Is just a place where they can log it. Now they can they're a little bit smarter. They can even bounce messages back into the organization if they know that the destination is not outside. They can do authentication against this thing and so on. So there is the gateways do provide some level of security. The most important thing that at least that the enterprises believe is the auditing and logging capabilities, which is, from a regulatory view, it is important. Although, unfortunately, some of the way these laws are written, they think that's all there is. I went to a health security conference, and all of the CSOs of these hospitals believed that everything was about auditing. They did this, it was kind of funny, they did this mock trial. And they basically had an employee who was doing backups, and she got a hold of the record of this mayor who was, I don't know, in there for mental illness. And she decided she didn't like the mayor, so she was going to publish this information. And they were the mayor eventually committed suicide. So they were going to sue the hospital. The family was going to sue the hospital that this shouldn't have happened. Well, the whole thing was that they're saying that the discussion afterward, where the jury found the hospital not guilty. Gee, what a surprise! They were all in the healthcare business. They're CSOs for a hospital. No, of course they didn't do anything wrong. But the afterward discussion was interesting because the whole discussion was around, if they had proper auditing, this wouldn't have happened. And I'm like, I'm scratching my head. I'm like, what do you mean? Auditing? That you know who did it. That was the whole point of this mock trial. They told you it was this employee. She went and did it. She didn't even try to hide it. They're so worried about the way this HIPAA regulation is written about auditing that gets them off the hook that they completely forgot that if they secured the data in the first place, she wouldn't have been able to see what the data was, and she would never have been able to publish it. So sometimes we've got people focused on the wrong thing, and hence that's why logging was the first thing that came up with IM. It's because the regulations really focus a lot on auditing. It's an after-the-fact kind of thing, and it's kind of frustrating. And so when you go to the hospital, just keep that in mind. The best deployment, I believe, and certainly this works differently for different size companies, is going to be, an in-house deployment. IBM same time is probably the poster child for enterprise class IM in-house system. I guess Microsoft RTC is new to the market. They're going to, they're the next one, and we know what's going to happen there. But again, this is like for almost any application. This isn't really necessarily unique to IM, but it's going to give you the best control, the best security, and so on. And certainly, if you have an ID department and data center and all that stuff, this one makes the most sense. And we talk to a lot of companies, and they're like, we already have a data center. That's sunk money. Putting this in-house is the only way we would even think of it. And certainly, when you're talking about the financial industries, that's where you start and that's where you end. There is nothing else because they can't afford to have that data going anywhere. And the way most of these other systems work is when it hits the server at the hosted site, you don't even know if it's in the clear or not. You don't know who can see it. Often it is in the clear, by the way. And you have no idea who's looking at that stuff. You don't know how long that stuff's sitting. It's kind of like email. Except in this case, you know it's AOL, Microsoft, or Yahoo. But you don't know who's looking at that stuff. You don't know if somebody's copying that stuff onto tape or DVD or whatever it is kids use nowadays for that. But you don't know anything. That's the problem. Once it goes out of your firewall, you really have to take the word of the person of the hosted site about what's happening. And we all know that even if you own it yourself, you still don't know the people. I mean, this mock trial thing, the employee was a good employee. They had no reason to suspect her. She'd been an employee for like 15 years. You had no reason to suspect that she would ever do this. So you still don't. So that's why you have to protect the data, and you can do it in such a way that one person can never have that much control. That you would at least take a group of people to conspire against the company to get that data out. But when it goes out that firewall to these hosted solutions, you don't know what's happening. So those are the ones. So I'm getting close to the end here. The future. Well, email's pretty ugly nowadays. I mean, it's this spam thing is pretty out of control. I get an unbelievable amount of spam. It's kind of weird. About a year and a half or a year ago, whatever, I got no spam. And all of a sudden, somebody turned a switch on, and I get unbelievable amounts of spam now, to the point where I delete at least one real message every day while I try to clean out my box of stuff. And the mail I get is embarrassing. It's not the good kind of spam. At least if somebody saw it, they'd say, "Oh, that's spam. Isn't that cute?" Mine is like, I could go to jail. I think it's really bad. I don't know how I got on these lists, but But it happened all of a sudden, too. Competitors are not nice. But email email is good for many things, and it still certainly has a place. I mean, people, it's going to be like for document delivery, it's, for statement delivery and so on, where you're delivering documents. It doesn't matter if they're there or not. It's just, like regular mail. But using it for businessy transactions is becoming a bigger problem. Spam is an issue. Of course, we all know virus is an issue. The latest thing, of course, is phishing, spoofing stuff, where Citibank sends me a message telling me that the terms and conditions of my account have changed. I actually got one of these messages. Luckily, I was immediately tipped off because I'm not a Citibank customer. But I started looking at it, and I'm like, wow, this is a very well-formed spoof. I mean, it looked just like an authentic Citibank message. I saved it, and it's a hard problem to solve because Citibank had nothing to do with it, right?
Right.
And it's hard to educate. It's an education issue.
There was a bunch of, if you look at the headers on some of those mail messages, you notice they're coming out of Comcast, and Citibank just doesn't use Comcast as a relay point. And some of the early ones I saw came out of Czechoslovakia.
They're very clever.
What's the equivalent for doing something like that in instant messaging? How can you don't have headers that you can look at?
Well, in enterprise instant messaging, that's a good question. In enterprise class instant messaging, you can't just send a message to someone who didn't already allow you to send them a message. Okay, so I mean, not everyone is like this, but certainly there are many enterprise class instant messaging systems where, in order for me to send you a message, I have to invite you onto my list, and you have to agree.
Well, that's for public IM.
Okay, well, it didn't used to be, if that's the case now. Well, on your buddy list, I think that's true, but isn't it also true that I can just send somebody an IM and the window will pop up? What was that?
If I opt it out, then you can.
Okay, so I know there was a time when that wasn't the case. So I'm not that close to the public IM systems. I admit that, but I know in an enterprise class one that whole doesn't exist. Now the other thing about enterprise class ones is everybody has to authenticate themselves just to connect. So you know who it is. You don't need to worry about headers and so on. There's an audit record of exactly who logged in, when, and in fact what they said if everything's being transcribed, right?
How rigorous is the authentication? How do you really know?
Well, that depends on the system, right? That comes down to the I mean, that's a whole other. I gave a 2-hour talk on authentication, so that's a whole other thing. But that's really up to the enterprise vendor itself. Like AOL. Their enterprise class one is based on digital certificates, but still it's a matter of how thorough was the issuance of the digital certificate, and they rely on VeriSign, to do that kind of stuff. Other enterprise class systems are, which are better for enterprise, are ones that integrate with the enterprise directory services, right? And it's really up to them as far as how strong I want to make that authentication. And luckily, there are standards in that area, speaking a little off topic, in authentication around SAML and Liberty Alliance and so on, which allow you to integrate with other authentication mechanisms, and then you can basically set it up for as strong or weak as you want. You can allow third parties to authenticate, and then you just set up trust relationships with the third parties, and you say, I'm going to trust that they did a good job authenticating. Now, within your own enterprise, typically you already have a reasonably good authentication system, even if it's just logging into your Windows machine. Most employers are pretty careful about who they let in to log in, right, and that kind of stuff, even just to pick up your email. It's also the norm as far as the strength of authentication is a username and password. But there are many companies now that are moving to much stronger forms of authentication, and certainly in the government, they're moving to better forms of authentication. But at the end of the day, it's up to the enterprise. And then there's an interesting issue of if you're an enterprise and you're communicating with end users, how do I know it's really them, and who controls that authentication? That's a whole other topic. But it's an important part of the whole IM experience if you're using this to communicate with people outside of your enterprise. So. I think IM and enterprise is being used for two places. One is internal usage, collaboration, productivity, and that stuff just internally, which is really what SameTime, for example, was meant to do. And then there's the idea of, and this is relatively new, of using IM to communicate with people outside my customers. Not necessarily through the public IMs, though. So I want to give them something that I control, I own, so they can authenticate against me, because I need to know it's really them. So, there's, like in the financial world again, since they're the ones who care the most about this, or even healthcare for that matter, they'll send, say, a statement out and have an IM window in it so that if you have a question about something on your statement, you can just type in a question. And it will go back to the enterprise, the organization that sent you the statement, and you can be communicating with somebody in customer support right away. I just had this on American Express bill. I got a duplicate billing. I saw the exact same thing was there twice. That couldn't be right. It would have been very nice just to say right there, duplicate billing on item 5, and have be talking to somebody. You could even be again a bot. It doesn't have to be a person right away. Instead, I had to pick up the phone, dial my 47-digit code, get through the menu, get to a person, and of course they ask me my account number again. That's the experience today. But if we were clever about, say, instant messaging, and this, you can only do this with secure instant messaging, then we can do this. It's much lower cost to them. It's a better user experience for the customer, and so on. So I think IM is almost going to be forced upon us because of what's going on with email. Although email is never going to go away because it still has its use. And in fact, it could be used as a way to set up the IM channel, just like IM could be used as a way to set up an alternative communication channel. But when is IM going to be as ubiquitous as email? That's the big question. Is, when can I just IM with anyone? And again, I think that's a ways out. And it's just too bad that we had an opportunity, it seems, to basically be designing these new protocols with security baked in right from the ground up. And actually, for the first time ever, we even have some other standards groups that we could leverage in the hardest area, which is authentication. Authentication is by far the hardest part of security. And for a change, we actually have some standards that a bunch of companies are finally agreeing to with the SAML and the Liberty Alliance stuff. And Microsoft's the only one right now who's not really bought in. But everybody else is bought in. There are people developing products, and they're big companies, not little ones like us. There's big guys that are doing this. So it's just too bad that we didn't take advantage of that in designing these protocols. So I think that's going to be an issue for a while. I think presence is really going to be a killer application, but this is where we talk about invasion of privacy. I was talking about this earlier. It's kind of an interesting paradox. People keep saying presence is going to be this big thing, but presence is all about knowing where you are and what you're doing at all times. And yet, we also talk a lot about, privacy in this country, invasion of privacy, and so on. And here we are talking, everyone's saying, yeah, presence is cool, and I want to know where you are, I want to tell you. But on the other hand, I want to keep my privacy. Well, it's going to be hard to get both those things. So it's going to be an interesting trade-off, and we'll see what happens with that. But right now, the cell phone vendors and all those guys are moving toward adding basically presence. Well, they already know, of course. When you turn your cell phone on, they certainly know where you are, who you are, and what you're doing. The question then is, are they going to release that data and how to the other systems? This is kind of like the AOL and Yahoo and so on. It's the same kind of problem, except really what they own is the presence data about your cell phones.
I want to argue about that because presence is only giving you some indication and that someone is actually online. That's all. You don't know where he is. You don't know what he's doing. So you don't have to saturate the privacy issue.
Well,
but in the cell phone world, there is presence goes into other things that geographically they know where you are.
Right.
You're not in Mountain View, you're up in San Francisco.
It will only be the cell phone operator.
His point was how much do they the cell phone operator eventually push back through other services?
Right, and the answer is they can push back whatever they want, right? So yes, in a sense you're right. They don't have to do that, but they can and they probably will because they have it. They have a lot of data about you when you turn your cell phone on.
You don't have to use it.
Yeah, they don't have to use it. Now your location may be not so important, but whether you're on the phone or not. Right? That might be useful because I don't want to contact you if I know that you're talking to somebody, right? And when I'm on my keyboard, if I've been inactive for a while, it shows up and automatically it says you've been active for so long. And when I start typing, it's active again. This is automatic. I don't have to do anything for everybody to know whether I'm working or not, right? So some people think that's invasion of privacy because I can just monitor when people are working or not, or when they leave. But I can also set manual status, right? I can actually go out of my way and say, I am at a meeting right now, or I am at lunch, right? Here's where to reach you. So there's also a manual status that you can voluntarily say, here's where I am, or here's what I'm doing to those people that you've allowed to look at that stuff. So that's the other issue is, is it okay if it's just people that you've allowed to look at you? Is that, I don't want just anybody to know where I am or what I'm doing, but it's okay for certain people to know. And so maybe that's the trade-off, right? And maybe that's about buddy lists and so on, and inviting people and things like that. And it also might be nice to selectively at certain times say, okay, I'm going to group people, and at this point I don't want this group to know where I am, or I want to make it look like I'm offline or something like that. That gets a little tricky depending on who ultimately has control, because if these are enterprise systems, again, the enterprise owns that, and some administrator can ultimately probably go in there and look exactly what's going on regardless of what you've said.
Also the case that we faced this with ISDN many years ago in trying to do caller identification, automatic number identification. There was a variation on whether or not you could supply information that was not necessarily authenticated information. Just in the same way as with buddy lists, people can lie about being on or not by saying, no, I'm not really here when they're listening into a chat room or something like that directly. They are unauthenticated, claiming to be something that they're not. Whereas in the case of a cell phone location, now we're talking about something that might be authenticated for the purposes of supplying access to the nearest gas station or something like that. And that might have a contractual part. There might be an agreement between a cell phone provider and a sales referral, for example, to that particular gas station, where they must insist on having it authenticated.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of those kind of examples, right? I mean, when you use your credit cards or whatever, all of what you buy is being reported to other people. They track all that stuff. Every time I buy food at the supermarket, they know exactly how bad a diet I'm on, and they just send me a letter that says your cholesterol's too high. They don't even bother, with anything else. So yeah, I mean, we probably don't even realize how much of our stuff is really being tracked. I have a chief security architect that works for me. He actually teaches at UCLA, and he is so paranoid about all of that stuff. I mean, he will never give his social security number, even when, specifically asked. He will never give his driver's license number. He doesn't want his kids' pictures ever taken digitally because somebody might post it on the web. I mean, he's very paranoid about anything that can track him. I think that's what happens when you know too much, about security, because at some point you gotta do something. Otherwise, your life becomes very difficult. But yeah, that's going to be an interesting thing, is how much, and it's really up to the vendors, up to the products, and so on, as far as what data they allow, and so on. I think my own personal experience is my productivity, and IM is very nice, because you can be doing multiple things at the same time. People could be all over the country or world, for that matter. Collaboration goes up. It's just, I really didn't use it before. I used like phone and talk and that stuff way back when, but not really on a really daily basis, that I do now. And sometimes it's really a necessity when your people are 3 time zones away and so on. And it's also nice because you can, again, I think this presence part is important. You can see exactly, if you know a bunch of people know the answer, and you can look and see who's online, you can go exactly right to that person and ask them exactly that question. You don't post a mail to a big list and then have either a bunch of people waste their time looking at the answer, or everyone thinking everyone else answered but didn't reply to the whole list, or any of the other things that could go wrong. At Microsoft, I remember this during the orientation, one of the big things they make a big deal about is don't do reply all. Don't resend the message to everybody on the list. And of course, everyone does that anyway, and you get all these big email trails. But they had a real big deal about their email system there. Was what they run. Enterprise class IM actually is better security than email, because at least it's being thought about. Email, we know, has been around forever, and we all know, as we saw before, nobody's really been using security to email because it's just too hard to use. So at least the enterprise class IM products probably have better security than email systems do. At least email, if you're talking about going across the internet. Certainly if you're using like All Exchange or All Notes or whatever, they have security within the system itself. But as soon as you try to send it outside, that's just a clear message, and That's it. You don't know anything about it. IM, nice thing about it, very easy to use. I mean, even my boss can figure out how to use this thing. It's just, it's a natural thing. If you can type, you can do it. And, we all know the kiddies are already brought up on this thing. I don't have to teach them something new. In fact, they're teaching a lot of us how to use it. So, IM, it is here, and I don't think it's going anywhere. I think the biggest issue is going to be the standards. The enterprise, I mean, the numbers on IM in the enterprise, I'm not one of those, I'm not a big numbers fan from those analysts because, I don't know, they just make up stuff. But empirical, I mean, just looking around, you know it yourselves. I mean, people are starting to use it. They're talking about they're using it in the enterprise. It's coming. It's going to be used, and I've heard a lot of people, they have good things to say. They can see the benefits. Sometimes I think we're a little early in some of the curves of how we can use it really well as far as customer experience and that stuff. So I think people are right now looking at it, using it internally within the organization, but we're still early to using it between an enterprise or business and their consumers. But I think that's a few years away once we get over this kind of hump we are in the market where people aren't really spending money on new technology, new innovation. But I think once they figure it out, they're going to realize that's much, much cheaper than call centers. The big differences between public and enterprise class really are the security, the controls, and being able to comply with regulations. If you're in a regulated industry, you have to be very scared about just the straight old public IM systems. Because even if you have a gateway, at the end of the day, it's still going to go out to these systems, and from that point on, you don't really know what's happening. And you're putting a lot of your trust and faith in these other organizations who don't exactly have a good track record for doing things around security. A lot of, like I said, there's a lot of people just downloaded IMs in their work without, the approval or the blessing of the CIOs and the IT groups, and that's causing problems. They're trying to figure out what ports do I turn off my firewall to turn this thing off, and it's proving to be a little more difficult than they thought. It's not just just flip this thing off and it's all gone. It's there's a lot of ways around it, and people are figuring it out, and they're switching. If they think, they figured out we're using AOL, we'll switch over to Yahoo because that does it a little bit differently, and that way we can get around them. So there's like this battle between the people, who are trying to use it because they whether they're using it for good or evil, I don't know, but they're trying to use it. Then you have the IT groups who are spending all their time trying to stop them from using it. So until they, kind of all agree that they're spending their time spinning their wheels, and it's kind of a waste. At the end of the day, it's going to be these standards. That's going to be the key. If we can agree on the standards, and also the big vendors who essentially own all the communities can agree on the standards and agree to open things up because it makes the world a better place, then that's when we're really going to get to what we think of when we think of email ubiquity. And so there's a lot of hurdles there because it's not just technical, there's also business issues. And I think it's going to be the business issues that are going to be the bigger issues there. And every vendor has their own philosophy about things like privacy, invasion, and so on. Who do I allow to see what, and how do I control this stuff? And there's going to be a lot of work for them to do just to implement all that stuff if they ever do open this up, because they're going to want to. I would think they would want to let their users ultimately control who can see what and so on. And while it might work okay in their system, it's going to be a lot harder when they're going across these other systems and so on, especially if the standards don't even support that. Then you're back to square one. Now we've got to negotiate with each other to figure out how do we even do that, because the standards that we're talking about don't even talk about those kind of issues. So there's a lot of stuff that needs to be thought about. You have a vertical markets like the financial guys. They came with their own organization to try to force the vendors to come up with a standard, because they're saying, well, we're the biggest bank. We got lots of money. We have your money. And we want you to have a standard. And that's, they wrote a one-page document saying, here, this IM should be this. And, I don't know how many people have read it. There were a lot of typos in it, so I'm gathering not too many. But that's kind of where they are. They're trying to put their muscle as an industry behind this thing and saying, we want IM, but we also realize that you guys all have to agree, and so we're going to try and force you to agree. And they're having limited success, I would say, right? But it's also early. Well, that's it. Oops, longer than I thought. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. questions? Terry, we'd like to recognize the effort people put in coming down here, so please accept this with our thanks. Appreciate it. Thank you for coming. I think it was a fascinating discussion and something we'll have to keep watching for time in the future and see where this goes and how it blends into using the internet for all kinds of purposes. The next meeting will be on the 4th Tuesday, which is just before Thanksgiving in November, and PQ will come here and talk about something we were talking about, traffic shaping and managing the bandwidth on your networks and making sure it isn't all you. I don't think they're worried about IM. I think they're much more worried about P2P. But trying to manage that situation. Does anyone have anything they'd like to announce? Any projects underway they'd like to talk about or anything like that? Okay. Well, then I thank you very much for coming. And if anyone wants to talk to the Computer History Museum, I'll step over to the side and talk about that. Thanks for coming.